I have a feeling this is going to come across a little old man being grumpy at the internet, but let's talk about a problem that I see in AAA development, which is over-specialization. So back when I started, back in 1997, you had artists or programmers or designers. Actually, there weren't even really designers back in those days. You had writers, and then design was done by a random assortment of other people. There was a little tiny bit of specialization, but really we were fairly undifferentiated. And people kind of moved around to do whatever needed to be done. When Baldur's Gate 1 was shipping, it was the programmers that did most of the plot scripting because there was just a lot to be done and we didn't have dedicated designers in the same way that exists now, so people did what needed to be done. But as engines have gotten more complicated, as games have gotten more complicated, as resources and assets have changed their levels of complexity by several orders of magnitude, to be honest, we've started to see more and more specialization. And I think for the most part, this is actually a good thing, because someone who is dedicating themselves to learning the craft of lighting or rigging or graphics programming, or shader optimization, or combat design, or level design, is capable of doing things to a fidelity level that generalists back in the 90s basically couldn't do. You don't really have the ability to specialize and become expert at something when you're having to wear every single hat. Additionally, you're usually getting not only better, but also faster at doing something because you're able to learn the tools to a greater degree. You're able to learn shortcuts that a generalist probably isn't going to spend the time to learn, or even if they do learn, probably isn't going to remember it for every single potential general task they might have to dedicate themselves to. When you look at a game from today, if you look at Elden Ring and you compare it to something like Baldur's Gate, this is just a way more complicated, way more specialized endeavor. There's just a lot more going on here. The animation is just insanely more complicated. The combat systems are more complicated. The level design is more considered. The engineering is more stable and more intricate. The code base itself is probably 10 to 100 times as big as what we were dealing with in the 90s. So a certain degree of specialization makes perfect sense. And honestly, I think in AAA is pretty much unavoidable. You want it because it allows you to do things that you couldn't do in the past. It allows your game to show off the expertise of a lot of different specialized experts. Whereas in the past, you weren't able to do that because you didn't have experts, you had generalists. But I feel like maybe we've taken it too far. Now we don't just have 3D artists as a specialization, or even character artists as a specialization, or even technical character artists as a specialization. In some cases, you're getting to the point where you might have character shader artists as a specialization. So this might be someone that all they do is build the shaders for characters for your game. And this is where I think we start to get ourselves into trouble. And why do I think that? Well, okay, so I have a couple of reasons, but I think the main one is about staffing. If you have the specialization we're just talking about in character art, when you do your planning, you might discover that you need 1.3 character shader artists. So how do you go about staffing that? Well, in a world of hyper-specialization, you really only have two choices. Either you have one of them, in which case you're actually short and your character shaders are going to be running behind and that person is going to be overworked and crunching and burning out, and well, then you might find yourself with zero. Or you're going to have two, and in that case, you have more capacity than you strictly need. And what tends to happen when you have excess capacity is that very rapidly you don't have excess capacity. What happens is that excess capacity finds work. But very often in game development, work generates work. If you're a technical character material artist, starts building more intricate and more complicated shaders, that might result very easily in extra work for the character modelers, or maybe there's extra data that needs to come from the rigging system or whatever. So if you have excess capacity, they're going to find work. And in almost all cases, when they find that extra work, they're going to generate extra work for other disciplines where you probably didn't have excess capacity. So now you find yourself in a different resourcing problem. Additionally, with hyperspecialization, you have a problem of resiliency, because if you just have one technical character shader artist and that person quits because they're overworked, or they get sick, or they decide they don't want to do this anymore and they want to do a different specialization now, then you've lost that capacity. You've lost 100% of that capacity, and you have no ability to deal with that because everyone is super duper specialized. So the second thing is that hyperspecialization also causes a lot of asset passing. On an extreme case, if I'm a generalist, I might make the concept, model it, texture it, rig it, animate it, put it in the game. Probably not that much of a generalist, but maybe in the extreme case. In the extreme end of specialization, I might have someone who writes up a concept, then a new person who actually draws a piece of concept art. Then someone does an initial model, then it goes to a new person to rig it, and a new person to animate it. Then it goes off to the person to design a specialized material to make it look its best. Now that it's been rigged, now it needs to go to the combat design group to decide how this thing is going to fight. And then that means it generates more new animation, has to go back into animation to get new animations built, go back into design, and get in a little loop there. Then someone actually has to take that thing and put it into a level in a combat encounter, which is built by someone who is different from the combat designer who designed the materials. Then someone has to come back and see that it's performing properly, and potentially send it back through this whole process again in order to tweak the performance parameters. So each of those points, when it changes hands, is a point of friction, is a point where the momentum of the thing slows down and it moves a little bit more slowly than it would if someone was able to carry the ball a little bit further. So even though at an atomic level, hyperspecialization can result in people being faster, more efficient, at a macro level, it can actually cause the opposite problem, because what's happening is you're getting a lot of slowdowns and stoppages as things pass from person to person to person. So what do I think we should do about this? Well, the first and I think easiest thing to do is to do some degree of cross-training within the broader top-level disciplines. So if you're doing something like DA Week, open up the opportunity for some degree of cross-training. If at the very least your technical environment shader artist has been cross-trained on the special work that the technical character shader artist is doing, then you have some degree of redundancy there. They may be hyper-specialized. They may be spending all of their time working on environment shaders. But if there is a sudden capacity need, or someone is gone or sick and there's an emergency, they at least have the ability to step into the role. They won't be as fast, they won't be as good, and they may not like it long term, but they'll be able to at least provide you some short-term capacity. I would argue, take it even further than that. Make sure that everyone that is making characters has some ability to at least understand how to open up the other parts of their job. Ideally, your character modeler knows how to rig, knows how the shader system works, at least knows how to attach one, knows how to twiddle the knobs, so that, again, there's a certain amount of resiliency there. It isn't something you're going to necessarily want them to be doing every day, but it builds in a little bit of excess capacity when you really need it. The second thing that I would be tempted to suggest, I feel like I want to have a pithy and cool phrase here, but something to the effect of round down with specialists and then make up the difference with generalists. So what do I mean by that? If you need 1.3 technical character material artists, hire one specialized, dedicated technical character material artist, and then make up the difference with a generalist. That generalist is going to be cross-trained on a much broader section of the artwork, and then they provide that excess capacity. Probably it's using way more than 0.3 of their time. It's probably using 0.6 to 0.7 of their time. And then the rest of that time can be used in other places, in other more generalized tasks. They aren't going to be your most efficient employees because you're using them as spackle, as filler around your bits of rounding in terms of staffing. But these people are the people that will become your specialists in the future because they're getting broadly cross-trained and they can find things that they may be interested in the future. And what it does is it gives you a bunch of excess capacity across a bunch of different disciplines. If you have a pool of 5 or 6 of these more generalized artists, then you're able to shift them around as needed to fill the most pressing need. Now, I think a very likely failure with doing this round down and then fill the rest with generalists is that that generalist pool could very easily end up understaffed. So what you might need is 10 of them and you only have 6 and you're running from fire to fire, never quite ever catching up. So if you try this approach, which is not an approach that I've actually ever done, make sure that your generalist pool is adequately staffed in order to make sure that you actually are able to cover all the little fractional people in your planning. And finally, this is just a cultural thing. Try to ensure that people are thinking of themselves as game developers first and their specialization or department or discipline second. The more developers you have on your team that think of themselves as developers, think of themselves as game developers, the more willingness you have for them to treat the other specializations around them as people, to consider the impact their work has on others, and to avoid the traps of all of the work getting bottlenecked by one bit of hyper-specialized work that they've just decided they're not going to do for themselves. Special thanks to my members. They provide the resources that this channel needs to keep running. If you're interested in becoming a member, there's a link down below to point you in the right direction. We have merchandise now. This is a very old school 2DA Forever shirt, which probably has an audience of 1, that audience being me. But if you want something that reaches way back into Bioware's past, this is the one to get. But there are other shirts for something if you want something a little bit more topical. What do you think about hyper specializations? Do you think it hasn't gone too far? Do you think it maybe hasn't gone far enough? Maybe we need to specialize even more? Let me know down in the comments. I will see you again soon. Thank you.